Time now for one more thing. Kimberly.
All right, thank you, Jesse. Well, Gina Haspel was sworn in to be the first female director of the CIA today after really quite a contentious confirmation process last week. And President Trump did attend the ceremony and spoke at the CIA headquarters in Virginia to offer his vote of confidence. He called her a very special person, will lead the CIA into its next great chapter. And she said that she feels tremendous pride at breaking through the glass ceiling, that she stands on the shoulders of heroines who never saw public acclaim for their work with the agency. She pledges to send more officers into the field and strengthen the partnerships abroad and at home. So I think she showed exceptional grit and determination throughout this whole process, and we wish her the best in protecting this country and keeping us safe.
Congratulations, Gina. All right, Dana.
Okay, so last night on Showtime's The Circus, where am I looking? Anywhere? Okay, there you are. On Showtime's The Circus, John Heilman was watching the daily briefing. Take a look.
Childhood education. We've talked about how we fund.
So the House Freedom Caucus still doing the president's bidding, trying to undermine the Mueller probe. You want to help me pack?
Aside from that terrific product placement for the show, I love it that he watches with his dog. That's all I got.
Very cool.
Very exciting.
I like it.
Juan Williams.
All right, so my son Rafi is getting married in just a few weeks, and this weekend he had his bachelor party. There he is with the guys, and they're on their trip to the Bourbon Trail in Kentucky. The guys included Big Brother Tony, and they made their first stop at Woodford Reserve. Here are the beautiful brass tanks used to distill the world-famous drink. And here's my son Tony with barrels of bourbon. Here's Rafi and one of the groomsmen walking towards the tasting room at their second stop, the Wild Turkey Distillery. When the guys got back home, we continued the celebration, but this time for Tony's wife, Erica. Look at that cake. It looks like a teddy bear.
Oh, it looks real.
But it's a delicious frosted confetti cake made by my daughter. The Legal Eagle, and I just can't believe she made the cakes. That was unbelievable to me. I've never seen a cake
talented.
like that.
Jesse, was mine better than Juan's?
It was a close call. Speaking of bourbon, Greg Gutfeld.
All right, time for Greg's fashion tips. You know, when you're going out for a night on the town, you should dress appropriately. Here I was Saturday night. I went and saw The Misfits. There's Glenn on the right. That's
this was Friday.
Right.
Was this Friday night?
Saturday night. That's Glenn, and that's Jerry from the legendary band, The Misfits. I, as you can tell, am very, very underdressed, but they came to play.
I'd say you fit right in.
Yeah.
Oh, you guys look like triplets.
Yeah, it was an amazing show, and we had a great time. And Jerry's mother, massive fan of the Five, should be watching right now.
Hi, Jerry's mom.
You must have been tired for being up so early for the wedding.
That's true, I was.
I
I actually had to bail in the after party. I was like a little too drunky drunk.
Okay.
Drunky drunk. Technical term?
Get ready for this. A baboon is on the loose at San Antonio International Airport. The baboon has escaped from its cage and is now being hunted down by animal life rescue officers. And they think they're going to get under control pretty soon, but we don't know where the baboon is. We believe it's
not
cornered somewhere. Cornered somewhere. No one has been bitten or wrestled to the ground yet, but we're going to keep you posted.
Shep is
Set your DVRs,
Shep
never miss an
yeah.
episode of The Five. Special report up next. Also on the loose in D.C., Bret Baier.
I'm actually out in California. No baboons here. Thanks, Jesse. President Trump meets with top justice and intelligence officials over reports of a spy in his 2016 campaign. The U.S. and China agree to make reductions to the U.S. trade deficit, a deal long on optimism but short on specifics. And House Republican leadership in turmoil as crucial midterm elections approach. This is Special Report. Good evening, I'm Bret Baier. We are coming to you tonight from the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California. More on why I'm here a bit later in the show. We begin on the other coast, however, as President Trump meets with 3 of his top national security officials after calling for a major investigation into reports the FBI had a plant, an informant, a spy, whatever you want to call it, in his presidential campaign in 2016. President Trump especially wants to find out what his predecessor, President Obama, knew about it. Judging by his tweets, the 45th president clearly considers this part of a big conspiracy. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge starts us off tonight with the investigation. Good evening, Catherine.
Bret, in a statement late today, the White House press secretary said there's an agreement for the president's chief of staff, John Kelly, to immediately bring together law enforcement and intelligence agencies with congressional leaders so that lawmakers can view the highly classified records they requested long ago.
A White House official said the president's concerns about an alleged FBI info would be raised at the meeting, which included Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, who has oversight of the Russia Special Counsel probe, FBI Director Christopher Wray, and Dan Coats, the nation's intelligence chief. After the president's weekend tweet calling on the Justice Department to investigate claims about the informant, the department quickly announced Sunday the expansion of an internal investigation into alleged government surveillance abuse. The new line of inquiry will consider whether there was any impropriety or political motivation in how the FBI obtained surveillance warrants or used informants to collect intelligence. The vice president told Fox's Martha McCallum the administration wants clarity and closure.
The president, I think, is grateful that the Department of Justice is going to have the Inspector General look into it and determine and ensure that there was no surveillance done for political purposes against our campaign. I think it would be very troubling to millions of Americans if that took place.
A source close to the matter tells Fox News that the Republican chairman of the House Intelligence and Oversight Committees, Devin Nunes and Trey Gowdy, want a discrete set of records, about 200, related to the intelligence source and whether their work was used in the Russia case or to obtain surveillance warrants on Carter Page, a Trump campaign aide.
All we're asking for is give us the documentation that you used to start this investigation.
On the Senate floor, the minority leader said the president's call for a parallel investigation set a bad precedent.
President Trump seems to have the terribly misguided view that the Department of Justice is there to protect his political interests and prosecute his enemies.
The president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, claims that earlier this month he spoke with special counsel Robert Mueller about the investigation ending by September 1st if the president agreed to a mid-July interview. Giuliani said the two men also talked about the alleged FBI informant. Giuliani said Mueller's interview with the president should be contingent on Giuliani having access to the informant.
Source familiar with the discussion said tonight lawmakers are waiting to learn more details about the proposed meeting, the timing, and whether all records requested by Congress, including those related to an alleged FBI informant, will be made available. Bret.
Kevin, thank you. More on this with the panel. Wall Street had a big day on news of a possible trade agreement between the U.S. and China. The Dow gained 298 today. The S&P 500 was up 20. The Nasdaq finished ahead 40. President Trump is celebrating this development, but some experts are saying China may be pulling a fast one on the U.S. And there is already a significant amount of hedging from both sides tonight. Correspondent Kristen Fisher reports from the White House this evening.
I, Gina Haspel, do solemnly swear.
Before presiding over the swearing-in ceremony of the new CIA director, Gina Haspel, President Trump unloaded on Twitter about his administration's approach to resolving a trade war with China, noting that China has agreed to buy massive amounts of additional farm and agricultural products and that barriers and tariffs will come down. After months of threatening to impose stiff tariffs on Chinese steel and aluminum, the Treasury Secretary made this bold declaration on Fox News Sunday.
We're putting the trade war on hold. So right now we have agreed to put the tariffs on hold while we try to execute the framework.
Secretary Mnuchin says that framework includes China's agreement to substantially reduce the trade deficit by increasing their purchases of goods. But when asked exactly by how much, the secretary wouldn't say.
There was a reason why we didn't put a specific number, and I would also say the specific number, again, whatever we agree to, these are not government-to-government purchases. We have very specific targets, industry by industry. These now have to be executed.
The Trump administration describes last week's talks with the Chinese and the framework it produced as substantial progress, and the markets responded accordingly as fears of a global trade war between the world's two biggest economies subsided. But today, there are bipartisan fears that this potential deal is letting the Chinese off the hook on one of its biggest transgressions. Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer urged the Trump administration to not sell out for a temporary purchase of goods without addressing the real issue, the theft of American intellectual property. While Republican Senator Marco Rubio said any deal that doesn't stop China from cyber theft and forcing U.S. companies to transfer technology to them is a huge loss.
So it's unclear if that issue, the theft of American intellectual property, is still on the negotiating table. As for what's next, the Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross is heading to China next week to try to turn this initial framework into an actual signed agreement. Bret.
Kristen Fisher live at the White House. Kristen, thank you. President Trump is also calling on China to keep up pressure on North Korea by sealing their shared border until a nuclear weapons agreement is reached. This comes on the eve of a meeting between the president and South Korea's leader. Correspondent Benjamin Hall has details.
President Moon of South Korea flew to Washington today ahead of President Trump's planned summit with Kim Jong-un, hoping to shore up plans after a number of setbacks. Trust between the US and North Korea hit shaky ground recently after Pyongyang's surprise move to break off a high-level meeting with Seoul, apparently because of recent US-South Korean military drills, which they call a rehearsal for invasion. They also threatened to cancel next month's summit. But in a tweet today, President Trump concluded by saying, "I want this to happen and North Korea to be very successful, but only after signing." Following years of provocations, though, others issued harsher warnings if North Korea pulled out.
I talked to the president 2 or 3 days ago. He's not going to be played. They're trying to run out the clock. They have a record of promising to give up their nuclear weapons. In reality, they build up their weapons. They've done this for 30 years. It's going to end one way or the other.
The first big test will come this week, when North Korea is due to destroy the Pyongyang nuclear test site in full view of international observers and journalists. Calling off that event, praised by President Trump as a show of good faith, would also be a major blow to ongoing negotiations. And this is not the first time North Korea has carried out such a show. In 2008, they destroyed a cooling tower at a nuclear plant in a symbolic show of its commitment to giving up its nuclear ambitions, only to conduct a far more powerful test the following year, something that the US will no longer tolerate. So despite the apparent success of that meeting between President Moon and Kim Jong-un just last month, the US is now moving more cautiously, aware of past mistakes. Bret?
Benjamin Hall in London. Benjamin, thank you. The Trump administration is outlining the terms of a proposed new nuclear deal with Iran. America's top diplomat is threatening what he calls the strongest sanctions in history if Iran does not comply. Iran is predictably dismissive. Correspondent Rich Edson has specifics from the State Department tonight.
The United States will implement an aggressive campaign to economically isolate and punish Iran.
These will indeed end up being the strongest sanctions in history when we are complete.
Borrowing a tactic and even a name from the administration's North Korea policy, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo promises an historic pressure campaign against Iran. State Department officials say they will continue working with allies to create a global coalition to counter Iran. Secretary Pompeo also warned companies from allied countries conducting business with Iran that the United States would penalize them if continued working with Iran. All part of what the administration says is a robust strategy to address Iran's behavior beyond nuclear activity.
We will track down Iranian operatives and their Hezbollah proxies operating around the world, and we will crush them. Iran will never again have carte blanche to dominate the Middle East.
Pompeo listed a dozen U.S. demands. Among them, Iran must abandon its nuclear work in perpetuity, provide international inspectors unqualified access, halt its ballistic missile program, release detained Americans, and end support for Middle East militant groups. In exchange, the secretary says the U.S. would lift sanctions and welcome Iran's return to the global economy. In response, Iran's foreign minister tweeted, quote, "U.S. diplomacy sham is merely a regression to old habits, imprisoned by delusions and failed policies, dictated by corrupt special interest. It repeats the same wrong choices and will thus reap the same ill rewards." British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, speaking just ahead of Secretary Pompeo, says a larger agreement addressing all of Iran's aggressive behavior won't be very easy to achieve in a reasonable time. Bret?
Rich Edson at the State Department. Rich, thank you. Let's talk about all of these foreign policy challenges with Brian Hook, Senior Policy Advisor to the Secretary of State. He joins us tonight from Washington. Brian, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Brett. Good to be with you.
Let's start with Iran and what Secretary Pompeo said today. How realistic does the Secretary, does the State Department, does the administration believe that these 12 stipulations will actually be agreed to eventually by Iran?
The list of requirements that Secretary Pompeo called out today in his speech on Iran is a very reasonable and realistic list. In fact, if you go through the list, it focuses on things like Iran's nuclear weapons program, its support for terrorism, its foreign wars that it funds around the Middle East, its violation of human rights. All of these are positions that the United States and its European allies have held at one time or another. And so this is the kind of new approach that we are taking to create a new security architecture in the context of the totality of Iran's threats.
Yeah, here's someone who negotiated before, former Ambassador Wendy Sherman, talking about this.
I think that Pompeo gave us a wish list today, and it's a wish list probably everybody could agree to, but you can't get it all at once because then you're negotiating against yourself as one is traded off against the other.
You respond to that?
Well, I think that's a very defeatist attitude, and I think that when it comes to addressing the full range of Iranian threats, we do need to take a comprehensive and very ambitious approach. And the speech that Secretary Pompeo delivered today does exactly that.
Yeah. On the tweet coming from the Iranians, at the end of it, it references that Iran is still working with European partners to continue the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement that the U.S. pulled out of. How much of a problem is that going forward, and how do you calculate that in?
I think that the United States and its European allies share a very similar threat assessment, and we've been working with them over the last few months to address the deficiencies of the Iran nuclear deal. We also made progress on all of the malign activities that fall outside of just the nuclear program. And I think a lot of that foundational work can be built upon, but we're not just limiting our work to the European allies. Secretary Pompeo has invited nations from around the world that share his concerns to join us in this diplomatic effort. We are looking to work with nations who are sick and tired of Iran's quest for a nuclear weapon, who are tired of Iran's terrorism, for its funding and fueling sectarian violence, for violating human rights. We've set forth a very ambitious agenda that we think much of the world can get behind.
I want to touch on two other quick things, but finally on Iran. What do you say to critics who look at this and say this really isn't about another deal, it's about regime change or the possibility of regime change?
The only thing that we'd like to see is a change in the behavior of the Iranian regime. And it's not just the United States, it's the Iranian people. The longest suffering victims of the Iranian regime are the Iranian people. And they are looking for a better life and a better future. They've had protests where they've expressed this. They would like to have better economics. They're tired of their government funding foreign wars and robbing from the Iranian economy to sow instability across the Middle East. And so we think that we've set forth the kind of positive vision that could actually change relations with Iran. The Secretary put on the table that if Iran is ready to change its behavior, we're ready to talk about a range of benefits, including full diplomatic ties, welcoming Iran into the global economy, and other things that would materially improve the lives of the Iranian people.
Well, it's a similar negotiation with North Korea. As we sit here today, what do you think the likelihood is that the June 12th summit moves forward between President Trump and Kim Jong-un?
Well, Secretary Pompeo has now made 2 trips to North Korea to try to set the table for a successful meeting in Singapore on June 12th. These sorts of things take twists and turns. That's not uncommon with North Korea. And so all we can do is try to be in a state of readiness and to do what we can so that we can have a very good discussion about, as President Trump has talked about, a very bright future for the North Korean people if the regime is willing to denuclearize.
And last thing, for the people up on Capitol Hill, people who are skeptical of how this is all coming together, what do you tell them that the administration, the president, is not going to give the store away or is not going to get played by either North Korea or China in negotiations ongoing?
Well, I think the president is coming in from a position of great strength. He has assembled the largest sanctions campaign against North Korea in history. And so he's in a very good position, whether the talks happen or not, whether the talks go well or poorly. The global maximum pressure campaign is going to continue until we achieve our national security objectives.
Brian Hook, Director of Policy of the State Department, thanks for being here. Love to have you back.
Okay, thanks, Bret.
When we come back, Venezuela in turmoil. The U.S. calls yesterday's presidential election a sham. We'll get reaction. Live here in Simi Valley, California at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. The Supreme Court ruled today businesses can prohibit workers from banding together in disputes over pay and conditions in the workplace. It's a decision that affects an estimated 25 million non-unionized employees. The court's 5 conservative justices held individual employees can be forced to use arbitration, not the courts, to air complaints about wages and overtime. The 4 dissenting liberal justices said the decision will hit low-wage, vulnerable workers especially hard. Texas Republican Governor Greg Abbott is inviting state lawmakers from both parties, top education officials, and others to the first of 3 roundtable discussions on curbing future school shootings. That session will be held tomorrow. Abbott is pledging to subsequently hear from advocates on all sides of the gun debate, as well as victims of a November mass shooting at a church in the town of Sutherland Springs. Meantime, the U.S. is calling yesterday's presidential election in Venezuela a sham, and it's turning up the heat on a government it considers illegitimate. Correspondent Phil Keating has the reaction tonight from Miami. Good evening, Phil.
Good evening, Bret. President Trump's new executive order on Venezuela specifically targets what it calls a kleptocracy on a scale not seen in Latin America, accusing the socialist regime's leaders of stealing up to 70% of humanitarian funds for their own pockets and using food as a weapon against the Venezuelan people. It specifically bans any American from purchasing Venezuela debt or state-owned assets. President Nicolas Maduro celebrated re-election last night in Caracas after an election boycotted by the opposition, where fewer than 20% voted. Even before the vote, the United States, European Union, and many Latin American neighbors said they wouldn't recognize the results, that it was rigged from the start. Vice President Mike Pence today followed with this, quote, Venezuela's election was a sham, neither free nor fair. Every day, thousands of Venezuelans flee brutal oppression and grinding poverty, literally voting with their feet. America stands against dictatorship and with the people of Venezuela. Up to 1.5 million Venezuelans have fled their country looking for food, medicine, and hope. Reports suggest the average Venezuelan has lost about 25 pounds over the past 2 years. And an administration official today says the exodus is on a Syrian scale at this point, a true catastrophe in the region. Adding that the Venezuelan economy has imploded so severely, the regime's elites are running out of sources from which to steal. So they're now liquidating state assets and selling off future debt payments for pennies on the dollar today. On Friday, for the first time, the U.S. government accused President Maduro of personally profiting from narco trafficking. The Trump administration is still withholding the possibility of devastating oil sanctions against Venezuela, which would further cripple an economy where inflation right now is 13,000%. Bret.
We'll follow all of this. Phil Keating in Miami. Phil, thanks. Up next, chaos among House Republicans as the midterm elections inch closer. We'll take a look. The reason I'm here at the Reagan Library is for an event tonight about my new book, 3 Days in Moscow, Ronald Reagan and the Fall of the Soviet Empire. For an upcoming special looking at that final summit in Moscow between President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, I sat down with Reagan White House Press Secretary Marlin Fitzwater, who reflected on President Reagan's push to end the Cold War.
Reagan said to Gorbachev, you know, you can't win this Cold War, and you ought to get out. And Gorbachev says, well, why? Why do you say that? And Reagan says, because we will outspend you every time. We've got the money. And people always ask me later about Reagan at that moment. Did he really think that there's going to be an end to the Soviet Union or that he could prevail. And I always said yes, because I really thought this was going to change. And he just hoped it was on his watch.
Tonight, House Republicans are dealing with more internal struggles over immigration, a farm bill, and a lame duck speaker with rapidly diminishing influence. All of this comes ahead of a pivotal elections in November, of course. Peter Ducey sets the table for us tonight from Capitol Hill.
Morning. This speaker keeps getting turned down by members of his own party. This year will be my last one. And now the retiring House Speaker Paul Ryan could be squeezed out this summer by his hand-picked successor, Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy. The Office of Management and Budget Director Mick Mulvaney revealed this weekend, quote, "I've talked with Kevin about this privately, but not as much publicly." McCarthy says a Weekly Standard report called, quote, "a coup in the offing" is completely untrue. Paul has my total support. But news of a shuffle comes the day that 20 Republicans continued working with Democrats to clinch enough signatures to go around Ryan to force a series of votes on immigration, including a DACA fix, and less than a week after the Ryan-backed farm bill failed.
This is the nature of the Republican conference. We've got conservatives and moderates, and whoever's in leadership, they have to curate that balance.
A Ryan spokeswoman tells Fox, quote, "This conference has always had its ups and downs, and the speaker will continue to move us forward as a team."
Paul Ryan.
Thank you. Ryan himself has long argued that members should want him around for as long as possible because he makes them so much money.
And it makes no sense to take the biggest fundraiser off the field.
Still, strategists see a potential positive in swapping speakers before the midterms, and the plans have reached the Trump administration because Director Mulvaney said this weekend, quote, "Wouldn't it be great to force a Democrat running in a tight race to have to put up or shut up about voting for Nancy Pelosi 8 weeks before an election? That's a really, really good vote for us to force if we can figure out how to do it." But one Democratic lawmaker who represents a district Trump won doesn't see Pelosi as a liability.
I don't think anybody on the Democratic side of the aisle is interested in a bunch of upheaval at this point.
Just a few minutes ago, Mulvaney's spokeswoman emailed me to say that he was speaking hypothetically this weekend and that he is not working behind the scenes to oust Ryan. And if you look at the numbers right now, there is a reason that nobody is publicly calling for a speaker's election. That is because nobody is believed to have the votes to replace him right now, including McCarthy. There are still multiple factions of Republicans that are going to want something in exchange for their support to help him win a majority of the House. Bret.
Fascinating. Peter Ducey live on the Hill. Peter, thank you. Let's get more on the problems for House Republicans and what they're facing ahead of the midterms. Senior political analyst Bret Hume joins us tonight from Washington. Good evening, Bret. You heard that story. Right now it's kind of in a theoretical sense, but what about this forcing Ryan to get out so they could get Democrats to vote for or against Pelosi?
Well, that's one of those clever sounding stratagems that you hear about from time to time where, you set up this vote even though it may or may not pass in order to force the other guys to vote in a certain way that will be politically disadvantageous to them. And it's tried from time to time. I'm not sure on the strength of that you're going to force out a well-regarded and popular speaker before he's ready to go. I'd be hesitant to believe that'll actually happen, although as we go forward here, the question of the speaker's influence as a lame duck is a real one, which is to say, if you're the speaker and you're trying to round up votes for a particular measure, and they know you're not going to be around and can't punish them if they vote the other way in any way, because he has all the power of appointment to committees and all that. If he's leaving, they might not be so eager to go along with him. So that's an issue. But you think about it, Bret, that's not really the problems facing House Republicans this time are not really wrapped up in the personhood of the speaker. They're wrapped up in the political gravity of a president's first midterm and the issues that confront the country.
Yeah, and that's a good point. It's classic Paul Ryan to say that I need to tell my constituents I'm not going to be around instead of kind of waiting until after the election to do that. But talk about the problems facing those Republicans. I mean, they've got this immigration potential vote, which is one of the reasons the farm bill went down.
That's right, and it's worth remembering that this caucus had some serious divisions within it, the Republican caucus, before Paul Ryan's announcement of that he was leaving. And the immigration measure, which is profoundly controversial, on which a vote may be forced, is a problem. The failure of the Farm Bill, as you mentioned, or as Peter mentioned, is a problem. They're going to have to get back to that Farm Bill at some point, and I suspect they will. But these are all the kinds of problems you don't particularly want to have as you're headed into a midterm election, particularly, Bret, a midterm election in which, the historic loss of the incumbent president's party in a first president's midterm is 24 seats. If 24 seats flip this time, which would be kind of normal, the Republicans lose the House. So you've got all that going against you. You've got the motivation provided by the personal animus toward Trump that so many liberal and Democratic voters feel, and that adds up to a high hill for Republicans to climb to try to hold on to the House. There's some recent numbers that make it look a little better. The so-called generic ballot, that's the one where you ask, would you rather vote for a Democrat or Republican unnamed in the forthcoming election? That used to be, the Republicans were like 16 points underwater in that, and that has narrowed a lot. That's a good sign. President's approval rating has ticked up. That will help, but it's still a huge challenge.
Yeah, uphill battle for Republicans. The right track, wrong track is going in the right way if you're in the House Republicans as well. Bret, as always, fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hillary Clinton says the country is living through a full-fledged crisis in its democracy. Clinton told graduating students at Yale University yesterday that she is still not over her loss in the 2016 presidential election.
No, I'm not over it. I still think about the 2016 election. I still regret the mistakes I made. I still think, though, that understanding what happened in such a weird and wild election in American history will help us defend our democracy in the future. So today, as a person, I'm okay, but as an American, I'm concerned. A Russian hat.
During the speech, she pulled out that traditional Russian Usanka hat and said, quote, "If you can't beat them, join them." Up next, the panel on President Trump's demand for an investigation in reports the FBI had a spy or an informant in his campaign. As I said, the reason I'm here at the Reagan Library is for an event tonight on my new book, 3 Days in Moscow, Ronald Reagan and the Fall of the Soviet Empire. As we head to break, former Secretary of State George Shultz explained to me President Reagan's method for dealing with the Soviet Union and Mikhail Gorbachev and his negotiating style. Advice, Shultz told me, that could translate today.
He had a system of going about things. Number one, be realistic. Don't kid yourself. No rose-colored glasses. Number two, be strong. Not just military strength, economic strength. You can't have military strength if you don't have economic. But then, more than that, have strength of purpose so people see what you're doing and they support it. Then number three, figure out what it is that you want. Don't start thinking about what the other people want, because you'll be negotiating with yourselves. Just what you want. And then when you got all that straight, sit down and negotiate. Then you get a hand to play.
If they ran a spy ring or an informant ring and they were paying people within the Trump campaign, if any of that is true, that is an absolute red line.
This claim by the president, the suggestion by Giuliani that there is a political spy embedded in the Trump campaign is nonsense.
The president, I think, is grateful that the Department of Justice is going to have the Inspector General look into it and determine and ensure that there was no surveillance done for political purposes against our campaign.
Well, this is the talk. What is the deal with this investigation? The president saying these reports of a spy and informant inside his campaign. He wants to get to the bottom of it. Today, meeting with the FBI director, the deputy attorney general, and the director of national intelligence, Dan Coates. We don't know exactly what was in that meeting, but we're told that he was talking about this. The DOJ put out a statement saying the department has asked the inspector general to expand the ongoing review of the FICE application process to include determining whether there was any impropriety or political motivation in how the FBI conducted its counterintelligence investigation of persons suspected of involvement with the Russian agents who interfered in the 2016 presidential election. As always, the Inspector General will consult the appropriate U.S. attorney if there's any evidence of potential criminal conduct. Rosenstein with his own statement saying if anyone did infiltrate or surveil participants in a presidential campaign for inappropriate purposes, we need to know about it and take appropriate action. So with that, let's bring in our panel from Washington. Jonah Goldberg, senior editor at National Review, A.B. Stoddard, associate editor at Real Clear Politics, and Katie Pavlich, news editor at townhall.com. Jonah, this seemed to pick up steam, and obviously it was fueled by the president's tweets about all of this ongoing. The fact that the Inspector General is now taking this, what do you think that tells us?
I think it tells us that there is credible reason to take a harder look at what was going on in 2016 in terms of the investigation of the Trump campaign. At the same time, I think the talk about this guy, as far as what we know now, being a spy embedded with the campaign is hyperbole. Having 3 conversations with people about their contacts with Russia that we know about is not an embedded spy. It is, maybe it's an informant, but it's not quite what people are making it out to be. I think the key word or the key phrase in Rosenstein's statement was for any inappropriate purpose. I think that there is ample reason that they maybe should have looked into Russian collusion or reports or suspicion of it. But if there was other reasons why they were doing it, or if they were trying to undo or hurt President Trump, or if there was a reason to believe there was political motivation, that would be very bad, and it's worth looking into.
Yeah, Katie, your thoughts on all this as it's developing?
Well, it's a good thing that the Justice Department is willing to look at this further, but the bumping it over to the Inspector General is prudent given that the people involved in potential misuse or abuse of power during the 2016 election are still working inside the Justice Department or at the FBI. The Inspector General doesn't have jurisdiction to interview political appointees who have worked in the Obama administration who may now be gone. And I would get back to all the noise surrounding this issue comes down to what launched the special counsel in the first place, whether there were legal instances of authority being abused in the 2016 campaign for political purposes. And the question is, you look at when this investigation happened after the Hillary Clinton campaign investigation wrapped up, then the Trump campaign was allegedly getting, an informant was giving information to the FBI. Well, if it was really just about Russian surveillance and interference in the election, then why didn't the investigation start earlier in 2015 when the Obama administration knew that Russia had planned to meddle in our elections?
Yeah. Here's Devin Nunes, AB, talking about trying to get the documentation.
And all we're asking for is give us the documentation that you used to start this investigation. We're trying to get to the bottom of what else was used in that FISA, because you have many people in the Department of Justice who are claiming that we're wrong. So if we're wrong, show us the information.
We're told a judge has received that, but Capitol Hill has not.
Well, Bret, this is a big battle about the separation of powers and what congressional investigators can do in their oversight roles to force documents from the Department of Justice, and which documents, after Rod Rosenstein has given many documents, he's resisting providing these with Republican members of the House on the Intel Committee. And they basically, this is a struggle to define what is, within the purview of oversight and what is overreach. I've spoken to people who, have their concerns about how the FBI might have conducted the Hillary Clinton investigation, but still say you can't share raw intelligence from an investigation that could be provided to the witnesses. So today you had DNI, you had FBI, everyone huddling with President Trump, and Rudy Giuliani, who's on a PR campaign demanding that he can't sit for an interview with the special counsel unless we know about other witnesses that were revealed in a New York Times story this weekend, who have met with John Jr. You can't demand that you be given information on a witness in exchange for talking to the special counsel. He says the meeting today, in which the demands for these documents is being made and reiterated by the president, He was doing that in his capacity not as a subject of the Mueller investigation, but as President of the United States, to make sure that Congress is getting what they need from the executive branch. So they're doing a really, really good job of muddying in this PR campaign what is and isn't allowed and what is and isn't appropriate. And that's a huge battle that's drawing out on both sides. But the president and Rudy Giuliani are trying, and Devin Nunes are trying to make it appear that the congressional oversight, members of Congress have the right to every single document, and the truth is that they don't.
Okay. We will continue to follow, obviously, all sides of both sides of this investigation. Next up, North Korea, Iran, and China, and the latest we heard today.
I will work closely with the Department of Defense and our regional allies to deter Iranian aggression. We will ensure freedom of navigation on the waters in the region. We will work to prevent and counteract any Iranian malign cyber activity. We will track down Iranian operatives and their Hezbollah proxies operating around the world, and we will crush them. Iran will never again have carte blanche to dominate the Middle East.
Secretary of State Pompeo today with demands for Iran, setting the table for the stipulations that the U.S., the Trump administration demands for a new deal. And these are those demands, 12 of them. Declare all previous efforts to build a nuclear weapon. Stop enrichment. Never pursue plutonium reprocessing. Unqualified access to all nuclear sites, even military sites throughout the country. End proliferation of ballistic missiles. No launching or development. Release all U.S. citizens being held. Halt support for groups, including Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Respect sovereignty of Iraqi government. End support of the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Withdraw all forces from Syria. End support for the Taliban and terrorists in Afghanistan. End support for terrorists and militant partners around the world. And end the threats to Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Other than that, they should have a deal. We're back with the panel. Jonah, your thoughts on this?
I think it's a great list, but the shorthand of that is stop being Iran. This is basically, Iran has been hell-bent on becoming a regional hegemon for a very long time. The Obama administration was determined essentially to let that happen in exchange for at least temporarily halting the nuclear program. I don't even think they even got that. And Eli Lake, our friend from Bloomberg, he makes the point today that the Pompeo speech really sort of signals that Pompeo is the anti-John Kerry. Basically, every sort of diplomatic initiative that Kerry thought was the pinnacle of the foreign policy towards Iran, Pompeo has flipped on its head.
Yeah, Katie?
Yeah, I would say what was outlined today is exactly what the Obama administration didn't put on the table for negotiation when it came to the Iran deal. The Trump administration made it crystal clear that they are willing to combat Iran on every single front with no stone unturned when it comes to what they are interested in. And as they talk about making sure this is in America's interest to protect Americans from the threats of Iran, whether it's through terrorism or nuclear proliferation, they've been very clear about backing their allies in the region. There has been a lot of criticism from European allies towards the United States for getting out of the Iran deal, but the allies in the region seem to be getting ignored, or at least not covered as much in terms of what they are saying about the Iran deal. And I find the extensive nature of what they've laid out today, maybe it's not all possible, but the idea that they are now going to give Iran a choice when it comes to more economic freedom, or are giving up your nukes and saying, look, at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to choose guns over butter in the end. You're going to have to make a choice between getting your money into your economy and embracing the people there who are calling for change, or you're going to have to deal with the consequences of continuing your proxy wars and spending all of your money on terrorism.
Yeah, I mean, a similar choice for North Korea, a little bit different. But the Iranians, AB, Sharif, tweeting out today that essentially this is a sham, U.S. diplomacy sham, merely a regression to old habits, imprisoned by delusions, failed policies, dictated by corrupt special interest. Obviously, the Israelis he's pointing to. It repeats the same wrong choices and will thus reap the same ill rewards. Iran, meanwhile, is working with partners for post-U.S. JCPOA solutions. I guess that was what I was trying to press Brian Hook on, is as this is going on, Iran is still trying or working with Europe, and at what level of success that could come to.
Right, and that's the bottom line. We don't know how effective the Trump administration can be in making a broad set of demands and dreaming of an actual new deal as long as Iran doesn't feel isolated. As long as the Europeans are still at the table with the Iranians, they can say, you know what, we don't need the U.S. and we don't need to give in to all these stipulations, which you played the tape from Wendy Sherman. I mean, they are viewed as unrealistic. And as Jonah said, they're sort of saying to Iran, just be perfect. And so with that, it invites the skepticism about whether or not the intention of and the influence of someone like National Security Advisor John Bolton on President Trump is to ultimately, combined with Pompeo's sentiment as well, is ultimately leading in the direction of regime change. This is obviously happening simultaneously with a negotiation with North Korea. The North Koreans are watching. They're very skeptical, of course, of John Bolton, as we all know from last week's news. And then the Iranians are watching what President Trump is doing at the table with the North Koreans, promising that they can get rich. So that's really the problem. Is all of this is happening at the same exact moment.
I have 20 seconds down the row here. The percentage of chance June 12th is happening in Singapore. Jonah, AB, Katie.
I think 90% likely something happens, 90% likely no huge major breakthrough.
I'm down to 75%, or maybe 70% on the meeting.
I'm going to say 50-50, but have it be delayed by a few weeks.
Okay, I tried. When we come back, the breakout star of the royal wedding.